This is a pole lathe, also known as a spring pole lathe. The billet reciprocates back and forth, but is sheared only on the downstroke of the treadle. The elasticity of the branch then returns the treadle back to the raised position, ready for the next repetition. This process is a heritage craft known as turning, but what you are witnessing is more than just that. This project was ignited by my fascination with John Plant's primitive technology, a YouTube channel demonstrating prehistoric skills and how to build things without influence from the modern world. Need an axe? Make one from stone and a branch. Need a pot? Mix your own clay and make a kiln. Although I'm a strong advocate for the preservation of these skills, in southeast London, where the modern world is all you have, there isn't the luxury of chasing notions of such an idyllic past. What Plant describes as a pastime and a form of escape, I began to implement seriously into the real world through an experimental and progressive approach to materials and processes which characterizes my design practice. At this stage, every object was an experiment, not in the sense of testing a preconceived hypothesis, but in prizing openings and just following where they led me. This way of working generated a broad variety of objects, such as a 3D printed flint knapping tool to probe this tension between high and low tech, primitive and modern. This provided a fruitful exploration, posing more questions than conclusions, and expanded the project into new territories. Of these objects, what later proved to be a catalyst for the project's progression was an axe made out of found materials from Rye Lane, Peckham. A primitive technology inspired by the Celt axe, but produced with found urban materials. Of course, it was not robust enough to be of use in any way, but it was symbolic of this re-evaluating and recontextualizing of the principles of primitive technology for a contemporary context, particularly with regards to making things out of what is immediately available. In the same way as our ancestors did with rural, natural matter, it was then just a case of seeing within this new set of raw materials what Martin Heidegger calls their manifest utility or potential for use, to become more than just purely emblematic, something utilitarian, and something that could be applied back into the environment from which it came. I live just off Rye Lane in Peckham, and so to do this, and in continuing with this extreme form of localized making, used the area as a culturally and materially rich region-specific parameter to work within. There were 5 abundant discarded materials that I could reliably find on almost a daily basis if I knew where to look and what time they were most likely to be there. These materials were pallets, pallet strapping, aluminium can, concrete, and brick. It would then be a case of exploring the potentials of this new and unique set of raw materials through practical and observational engagement, eradicating preconceived notions as to what they were, and in turn, stimulating new treatments for them. Their properties as not attributes, but histories. I would come to understand them in terms of their instrumentality, in relation to me and how I might use them. This material exploration was situated somewhere between the recontextualization of prehistoric processes and the cultivation of a new set of contemporary craft skills, all of which achievable through low-tech means. Stripping pallet strapping into fibers, heat pressing, weaving, and twining cordage, deconstructing pallets, joint making and producing charcoal, knapping and grinding concrete, melting, reforming, and crimping aluminium can. There were 1,000 possibilities in one of these materials alone, but it was actually the technical restrictions these materials carried with them, and one in particular, that provided the key to unlock the next stage of the project. Before attempting to turn pallet wood on a machine lathe, I was stopped by a technician and told that this would not be possible. And not only that, but I wouldn't be able to work with pallet wood on any other workshop machinery without risking damaging them. This is because it's rough sawn. In many cases, it can be contaminated with chemicals, can be stained with oil or food, and often contains nails hidden within the wood. This moment was pivotal, because within this restriction, this technical hurdle, was an opportunity. It didn't really mean that I couldn't turn pallet wood. I would just have to work out a new approach, albeit in a roundabout way. And to do this, I devised a plan which would serve to channel the practical aspect of the project into one coherent process, while allowing me to materialize and expand its conceptual framework neatly. In the workshop, I couldn't turn on a machine lathe, or use any other machine tools to work with pallet wood. I could, however, use hand tools, and in doing so, make my own tools comprised of as many urban materials as possible. With these tools, I could then build my own lathe out of pallet wood, to then turn pallet wood on Rye Lane, the location from which the materials originate from. So I began to make these tools, which would then be used to construct the lathe on site, remotely to the workshop, cataloguing the locality of materials used, how much of the tools were self-made, and which workshop machinery we used to make them. This toolkit would consist of a rule, a handsaw, frame saw, rebo saw, chisel, mallet, hammer, and crowbar. Making each of these tools involved the one previously made in some way. The saw required the ruler, the chisel required the saw, and so on, as a systematic process of de-technologizing machinery. It was at this point that a concrete field of concern really began to reveal itself. Within anthropological and philosophical theories with regards to objects in making, I had identified 5 key emerging themes which directly related to this process that I was undertaking. It would then be a case of navigating and measuring those key themes in constant reference to my own experiences moving forward, an autopoietic study. Technology. Technology, or tools, made and used throughout this process would become less advanced. This was not to prove that a purely low-tech future is progressive, but to transgress the space between high and low-tech, in order to evaluate the socio-political, cultural, and environmental systems in which they exist. Localization. Materials used to make the tools would become increasingly localized to Rye Lane, Peckham, where they were found. Again, this would be a backpedaling to ways of making that would require familiarity with what was available in the local bioregion, and mastering the skills that they would allow me to perform. This opposes most methods and services we engage in today, which require systems and networks, such as transportation and the division of labour, if they're to be viable. Authenticity. How I made these tools would become increasingly authentic, in the sense that they would be more self-made. I would strive for handmade as a justified mark of distinction, in a moment where to class something in this way is far from the obvious statement it once was. I wouldn't be able to transition swiftly to tools made completely out of local materials by me to be holistically authentic. Rather, I would have to work backwards, transcending tool evolution gradually in reverse. A process of authenticity. Haptic feedback. My level of rational and reflexive thought would increase with the greater haptic feedback that these less advanced tools would involve in their use, developing hand motor skills through a systematic de-technologizing of machinery. This would serve to overturn the overall trend of technological progress, which has essentially been from hands to fingertips, and re-establish a relationship with tools that is haptic rather than optical, sentient rather than rational, to put the thinking back into making. And lastly, self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency would increase with the greater quantity of tools that I was acquiring. This series of actions would be an iterative mechanism, serving to invert the present deep structure of tools, and a process of inquiry, of whether having tools to work with could enhance my range of freedom as opposed to tools that work for me. Ivan Illich suggested that an individual relates himself in action to their society and invests the world with their meaning to the degree that they master their tools. So the reason I was undertaking this process was as a critical tool in itself, to see how I could do just that, in a moment where the world is increasingly at my fingertips, but also completely out of my hands. Again, not as a mode of resistance to technological change, but rather to expedite the relationship between humanity and their tools, characterized by sensation and consciousness, while also utilizing the sciences and discoveries which have made us masters of our time and place. It was at this point, when the toolkit had just been completed, that the country went into a lockdown induced by the COVID-19 pandemic. What the project had pushed for since the beginning was suddenly thrust into practice, not just for myself, but society as a whole, including widespread changes to current modes of thinking, making, and distributing, and a reconfiguring of supply chains where decentralized local networks of small-scale manufacturers could offer viable alternatives in many cases. What this meant for the project practically was that on top of the material restrictions as a motivation for building my own lathe, I now had no other option if I was to reach this goal of turning pallet wood. As well, the freedom these tools gave me, tailored to the characteristics and resources of where I would eventually find myself isolated, was ever more essential, because no longer would I have access to the workshop tools. The lathe was going to be built and operated on Rye Lane itself, in this specific location, and using this tree as a return spring for the treadle. But due to the implementation of social distancing, this could no longer be done. The audience had to change, albeit slightly, because no longer could I rely on passers-by as a source of discussion within the local community during the build. Alternatively, I set up a workshop in my back garden, still in Peckham, and shifted the project more into a virtual space to reach an audience, albeit a less localized one. Under the new title of Lathe, this consisted of a website, lathe.com, a YouTube, Instagram, and Reddit. Within the website was a 10-minute introduction video and about page detailing what I was doing and how it was driven conceptually. A primitive technology style vlog, uploaded daily, captioned with prompts and thoughts for discussion regarding these conceptual drivers during the build, and an independent forum to facilitate that discussion, Lathe Community. And so with these platforms in place, the Lathe build began, and I felt a heightened sense of purpose in what I was doing now that I had an audience, and given the increased pertinence of the project in the context of this strange new situation. When working with an array of non-standard materials such as these, it wasn't a case of designing a blueprint and then executing those plans. Rather, the design for the lathe would emerge organically, through the same process I had been practicing up until that point, which was reacting directly to the fluxes of the materials in front of me, navigating and embracing the histories embedded within them. The fishy smell from transporting seafood, the knots, the cracks, the bent nails, and bows from heavy loads. However, this is not to say that I didn't have a vision. This lathe would be a direct translation of the traditional rural pole lathe, adapting every aspect of their design to suit the palette and the urban environment. In exactly the way I'd hoped, I was experiencing this conversational feedback with and between local materials, measuring them up against each other directly, compensating the concave of one piece with the convex of another, and so on. This was a process which required greater care and thought through the ductus of the hand than aimlessly cutting pieces to exact dimensions through the interface of buttons or keys. A reversion from this flat world of today to a wobbly world of the past, before precise measuring tools and standardized materials had removed this responsibility. In previously making the tools I was now using, I had ignored the fact that pine wasn't the ideal wood for tool making. But I had stumbled upon a specific instance where, due to the material's history, it had become a separate urban species of pine, which was proving its robust capability. For these same reasons, though, it was very difficult to deconstruct pallets, and so I took advantage of their pre-existing physical structure wherever possible. Here, I'm deconstructing and reconstructing one of the saws around a pallet in order to keep it intact, but still cut down the grain. Small moments like these encapsulated the entire project, because they were evidence that I was being immersed into the thematic timeline I had hypothesized weeks before. In this case, something I had made myself, the saw, tailored to the materials it would later be used on, pallets, allowed me to achieve something I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. I had made the saw myself, and therefore I knew exactly how it worked and how this could be done. And so in this sense, I had successfully enhanced my range of freedom. As the lathe began to take shape, upvotes, downvotes, comments and shares were a quantifiable buzz expressed by online communities engaging with the project. Many took the time to share similar experiences, advice, thoughts and criticisms with regards to their own realities. This signified that despite an emphasis on locality, what the project stood for in terms of resourcefulness and self-sufficiency was universal and could be identified with beyond the boundaries of Peckham. As well, although I became knowledgeable in these materials specifically, from the offset it was made clear that I wasn't an expert woodworker by any means. In a similar way to primitive technology, videos of the build were designed to tap into a sense of goal contagion, whereby portraying the process as doable increased the likelihood that viewers would engage in a similar activity. It was my hope this could be translated from a virtual space into the real world, and so it was time to inaugurate the lathe publicly. I realised that the lathe could still be publicly visible, despite not being on Rye Lane in the original location I had planned. So as an alternative, I set the lathe up outside my door front, which in times of social distancing exists as a new common for interaction. When hooked up to the tree, the environment became part of this machine, and after a few adjustments, I had done it. I had made the lathe, an object which took 10 days to build, but 4 months to develop, through a systematic de-technologizing of machinery, a process of authenticity, of self-sufficiency, and of extreme relocalization, of using tools to make a machine out of materials that can be found in Peckham where that machine would be made and used. The lathe consisted of a pallet wood frame joined with reused pallet nails. The cord reaching up to the branch and around the billet was separate pieces of pallet strapping stripped into fibres, twined into cordage, and then held into one length by crimped aluminium can. However, without me it remained simply a configuration of static entities. Only when I used it as a machine would these substances be assigned to their new destination as the lathe. To do this would be to achieve a feat that its high-tech counterpart could not, when bound by the rules and regulations of its workshop environment, which was to turn pallet wood. But for this to become a performance, there had to be eyes and ears to receive it, and only then could it have any sort of impact beyond my own recognition as an outcome. This would be for the community local to where the materials of the lathe were gathered, to bear witness to an age-old process, recontextualized for a new and vastly different reality in which they exist globally. A reality where it has never been more valuable to have tools to work with, as opposed to tools that work for them, and where using what is to hand must go beyond simply getting by. In understanding this encounter, this community is called to realize the capacity of the materials around them, to reconsider their urban environment as a nurtured and valued source of employment, and appreciate that technology can be liberated in the service of their independence. The theoretical framing of this performative act proved itself graspable to the passerby with only minimal explanation. The new type of raw material the lathe is made from implied a sense of resourcefulness and localization. The dramatic act of turning on it was denotable as low-tech, yet functional, and there was evident heavy involvement of tacit knowledge. Viewers would often interject, offering poignant comments and thoughts at face value, leading to deeper discussion led by either them or myself. I could then refer them to lathe.com for further background information, documenting and mapping the build, which was also a space where the performance could be encountered virtually via live streaming. One question that would be frequently asked was what was I making? I would reply honestly saying that I didn't know, and that I was turning for the sake of turning. It was a perpetual exercise unencumbered by results, a practice. At this point, what materialized was just a byproduct of the performance, and perhaps a token of its occurrence. To begin with, this turned pallet wood was extremely crude. The material couldn't be further from the far softer, freshly felled green wood that the traditional pole lathe was designed to turn, and my chisels had been blunted from weeks of heavy use. But to what capacity the lathe was functional didn't matter. It just had to exist. That being said, as the leaves grew on the tree, so did my turning skills, through constant conversation between the piece, the machine, the location, the chisels, onlookers, and myself. Each piece was more refined than the last, and after 4 days of turning, I focused my attention to what could become of them. During the build, Harvey and I had invented a game using scrap pieces of pallet wood, out of sheer boredom in isolation. There was no aim to it, just throwing a block back and forth with 2 planks, one each. So with what I had turned, I decided to make bats for this game, as a composite of materials, technologies, and processes I had explored throughout the project, and the need driven by the situation. The turned handle was attached to the plank with glue I had made previously out of pine sap, collected from Rye Park, and mixed with charcoal from pallet wood. The V-joint I used is heavily associated with the cricket bat, which along with other sporting goods was what busyboarding was most notably known for manufacturing in the early 20th century. This occurred in the heart of Peckham, and only 100 yards from where my lathe was operated. What resulted was a homage to the cricket bat, subtly nodding to Peckham's manufacturing heritage, created for a new, lockdown-induced backyard-scale game. This has been a project concerning tools and technology, transgressing the space between high and low tech in order to evaluate the socio-political, cultural, and environmental systems in which they exist. It has been an exercise of 4 other key concepts within that: localization, authenticity, haptic feedback, and self-sufficiency, put into practice to further my understanding of the interplay between them. The lathe itself signifies that to be creative within the confines of our limitations is the best hope we have to transform ourselves and collectively transform our world. As an outcome, the performative act of turning was underpinned by the process of the lathe's becoming, as well as what became of it. With the lathe at the centre, the tools and the bats, along with the virtual space, writelathe.com, integrate to embody a localised, socio-political initiative, a mechanism for debate, awareness, and thus change, encountered by the people of Peckham as the spectacle of turning palletwood.